making the regulator and government and all the stakeholders more aware of the need for a domestic price discovery. Because the point is, if India is one of the largest consumers or producers of various commodities, and then why should it not be the center for its price discovery, the center for its trade, center for its delivery? So as we say that Make in India can only be successful if you have the ability to trade in India and also price in India. Just by making the farmer does not get a good price or the manufacturer doesn't get a good price, it will not help. So making will only be helpful if you can get a good price for it and you are able to sell your produce timely and properly at a fair price. So that is why we believe that the exchange ecosystem can go a long way in making Make in India successful by allowing for price in India and trade in India. So thank you very much, and back to you, Debo.
Thank you, Mr. Nathani, for your theme address. I now request Mr. Wadhwa, Narinder Wadhwa, President of CPAI, to kindly give the inaugural address. Mr. Wadhwa, please.
Thank you, Deboji. Good evening, everyone. Rishiji, Deboji ji, and team MCX. Our eminent speaker for today, Professor Joshi Jacob, respected members of our community and others who are attending this. We welcome you all in today's webinar. I sincerely thank Rishiji and team MCX for associating with the CPI for this webinar series on research papers by various professors, especially IIM professors on commodities. Today's webinar is on very relevant topic. Being an import-dependent country, we greater depend on global trades, pricing in the base metals, relied largely on the London Metal Stock Exchange and other markets like Shanghai and Singapore. As Nathani ji has just mentioned, the slogan of Make in India we will achieve that once we have our own benchmarks and we trade in India and we relied on our benchmarks. So going forward, we are looking for ecosystem which is conducive enough. As he has rightly mentioned, we are consumer or importer of many metals, many commodities, whereas we relied on the prices which are quoted in the other market. So going forward, we would like our ecosystem to be in place so that we relied on our local benchmarks. But for having a local benchmarks, we need to have a greater quality standards, warehousing and warranting and other things in place so that these things really are relied on. These reference pointers of various benchmarks like LME are there because they have a standard system. There are standardization, quality assurances, warehousing and delivery, which is there is a clearing for deliveries also. So definitely we wish that we should have our own benchmarks. So I'll not waste much of the time and directly we are eager to listen to our professor today, Professor Joshi Jacob, and we'll see that how these studies can help us in forming our local benchmarks and go to our regulator also and exchanges to see that these things are in place. Thank you, Debojit. Back to you.
Thank you, sir. So now let's come to the main part of the event today. I request Professor Joshi Jacob of IIM Ahmedabad to kindly make his presentation on the theme of today. And after this presentation, we'll have a brief discussion, a brief panel discussion. But before that, we'll have this presentation by Professor Jacob.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, one and all present here. I would like to use this opportunity to thank Mr. Wadhwa for helping us disseminate the findings of the study and reach the relevant audience. I also thank Mr. Rishi for the kind words of introduction. and Debo for organizing this event. Thank you so much. Uh, as the introductory remarks were, we know that India is actually at the cusp of taking an near industrial revolution, building infrastructure, be it in transportation, power, or in industrial production. And we know that base metals are actually the key to that growth. And we have seen the lessons from China that they have built, you know, huge market for a lot of commodities, both base metals and precious metals and chemicals and agriculture commodities. So our idea in the study was to really interact with various stakeholders of the market, uh, and including international market participants, and figure out why do markets like China has eventually attracted a lot of volume and seem to be price setting themselves, and the rest of the world look up to, at least in some commodities, what is the kind of signals from the Chinese market. That's one input that we have taken. The second is, go back and examine the data and see where do the Indian market is situated, and then evolve with certain policy suggestions. So what we have specifically done is we wanted to understand what drives the uh, significant growth of markets like China. Uh, is there something that we can sort of take away from their, given their experience of having built a relevant domestic market? And then we wanted to also examine how the Indian market efficiency compare with the non-markets like LME, SHFE, and COMEX, and see if we are actually at par or quite left behind. And we know
Professor,
that
a small interruption. I think the voice is not very clear to some of the participants. So if you could bring the mouthpiece closer.
Yeah. Sorry, there is a bit of trouble at my end because there is an AC which is making some noise unexpectedly. I'll try to be as clear as I can. So the other point that we wanted to cover is that we have moved away from cash settled contracts to physically settled contracts. And we often believe that that should lead to greater convergence between uh, the spot prices and the futures prices, because eventually that is something uh, that is likely to be what the futures market expected to be. And lastly, evolve with policy suggestions for development of the domestic price benchmarks, and gradually by and by help the market to evolve with a benchmark of our own. So one of the markets that actually attracted our attention, and which ought to be, is we thought is China. Uh, so we wanted to understand what has led to the competitive, success of, or what has made the Chinese market quite successful in attracting volume and being able to be a market to reckon with, and in some commodities at least lead the market. Something that there are many observations that we have, uh, but we wanted to really focus on some of them which are quite relevant for us. Uh, One is that we found that the Chinese market is quite careful. The regulator particularly is only in allowing exchanges to introduce contracts where they think China has unique advantage in information. So obviously, these are contracts in which China is a key supplier or is a key demand source. In the interactions, we could gather that the Chinese market participants truly believe that, given the extent of influence they have in the market, either as a source of demand or as a source of supply, they have relevant price information to price that in the market. This has actually charged up the entire retail community. Of course, if you are dealing with a large retail community in the commodities market, then we know that quite often that could probably have a certain chance of being a destabilizing influence on market efficiency. But what we find is that in a way they are actually able to manage the retail presence without creating significant impact on market efficiency. One way by which they had been able to really manage the retail presence without building huge price pressure and then reversal or high volatility is necessarily through a margining and positioning limit system. Particularly, the margining system has increasing margin with time, far more discrete than in other markets. Number one. Number two, unlike many other markets, they have actually position restrictions for individual traders as the contract is getting close to maturity. This, in a way, actually prevents retail presence having an overbearing impact on price efficiency towards the maturity of the contract. So in a way, they are actually able to bring a whole lot of retail pool, which believe that they have unique price information, without necessarily leading to, huge market efficiency problems. So that's what has actually created a certain amount of depth in the market, and building on that depth, it has now become possible for hedgers in the Chinese market to really benefit out of the liquidity, because if a manufacturer or a fabricator is offloading his risk, that would be absorbed by the small traders, and therefore hedging in the Chinese market has actually become cheaper for them. So this is one element where the uniqueness of the constitution of participants actually creates volume and depth in the market. Further, to really bring more participation in the market, they have actually provided contract structures in such a way so that the contracts are more retail suited, I would call, in the sense that the trading lots are far smaller than delivery lots. That makes it kind of tokenization of the contracts to suit the retail appetite. Moving on to other elements of why has China become so, such a large market to reckon with. One of the important moves that they have done is they have restricted the hedging of Chinese companies largely to the domestic market, except for the large players who can hedge elsewhere, and the state-owned entities. The rest of them have to necessarily hedge in the domestic market. This has actually created sufficient participation or enough participation from the entities which are actually interested in hedging their risk in the domestic market. While there is no explicit restriction that actually prevent all Chinese firms from trading in international markets, practically their firms are limited to the domestic market. And of course, when we examine the cost competitiveness of the market, we could sense that the overall cost of trading in the Chinese market is roughly 60% of what would be the equivalent cost in India. This is aided by several factors. They don't really have a commodities transaction tax. They have good warehouse financing system, and of course including financial technology being leveraged for the warehouse receipt and so on, such as blockchain. So several pieces of these enabling infrastructure and regulation has brought Chinese market to necessarily the prominence it has reached. So one thing that I would like to emphasize here is that it's not a market which is grown without and stabilized without the government intervention. There is active participation from the government from time to time, be it nudging the participants to hedge in the domestic market, or is it in providing incentive to traders to trade in the market. There are a number of ways which the government is actively involved. Okay, so I think in a market like India, the big lesson from the Chinese market is that we need encouraging steps by the government, and probably get the traders to trade more in the commodities market and see that bit differently from the stock market, where necessarily it is just about investments and not necessarily about risk management, which is a fundamental function that is served by the commodities market. Then as a part of the study, we actually tried to examine the price efficiency of the base metal markets in India and compare it with the rest of the non-markets like SHFE, LME, and COMEX. Of course, we know that in India, the market efficiency is, market liquidity is largely limited to the near month and same month contracts. So therefore, we have actually limited the study to these two sets of contracts. Of course, that's a limitation that we have, but everyone understand that when we talk about 4-month contracts, there is relatively little liquidity or low liquidity that we have. The idea of this study is very simple. We know that the basis, the difference between the futures price and the spot price should be driven by the expected change in spot prices in future. So therefore, in technical terms, we are necessarily running a regression between the change in spot prices between any two time points and the difference between the futures price and spot price. Ideally, if the futures market is fully digesting the likely price changes in future, we would expect the basis to fully explain the price changes and any carry cost or transaction cost involved in that will be captured in this constant. So basically, we expect the beta to be 1 if markets are super efficient. And we actually cover a time period between 2010 and December 2019. Of course, spot prices are not available everywhere. We depend on the Bloomberg data for capturing the spot prices. Wherever it is unavailable, we employ the same month futures prices, which are actually proxying for the spot prices at that point in time. I'll quickly take you to the results. What I have portrayed here is necessarily the relationship between the basis and the changes in spot prices. We know that the ideal benchmark should be 1 for that estimated number, because we expect that for every dollar expected change in spot prices in future, we expect the basis to widen by $1. That's what we would expect in an ideal market. And here is a comparison that you have of the 4 different metals: aluminum, copper, lead, nickel, and zinc. And one can see here that LME has nearly value of 1 for all the contracts. It's indistinguishable from 1, which is necessarily indicating that, oh yeah, the market is very close to discovering or capturing the likely movement in spot prices in future. Same story for COMEX. When we look at SHFE, we find that the aluminum contracts don't really have that kind of efficiency. Rest of it, copper, lead, nickel, and zinc has. When it comes to MCX, we find a sort of mixed result. On contracts like nickel and zinc, we find that the efficiency is quite as good. Even aluminum, the efficiency is quite good. On copper and lead, we find that it seemed to have significant departure from what we call as the efficient norms. The beta or the estimated relationship is not 1. For example, it is actually somewhere between it's around 0.27 here, and it's about 1.75 here. If I take a 1.75, maybe it indicates that in some ways the markets are overreacting to expected changes in future, spot price changes in future, whereas it is actually less reactive to expected changes in expected price changes in future for the copper contract. Now, of course, the good news is that for a lot of contracts, we actually have efficiency levels comparable to others. Maybe the news for caution or precaution is that on some commodities we don't really have the efficiency that the other markets have. And then we were actually trying to understand, given the inputs from various market participants, like what could be the reason why we end up getting lower efficiency for some contracts. Of course, we could not necessarily get any specific inputs on necessarily why these two commodities, that we could not really have an answer convincingly to really sort of share that, this is exactly what happened in this commodity. But broadly, one can say that, yeah, fine, it looks like the Indian markets have much higher trading cost. And one of the reasons why we think, and we had actually examined this in an earlier study which we did find that the one of the major components that actually add to the cost of transactions in India is the commodities transaction tax, which prominently figures, as part of the total cost. Of course, one might wonder, I mean, what would you do? What would happen if commodities transaction tax is suddenly imposed? Is it only that, traders just lose some profit? We think that there are two effects of that. Number one, of course, there is a loss of, opportunity to trade and make money out of that, which is the engine by which markets come to efficiency. On the other hand, we also think that it actually has sucked out liquidity from the market, widening the bid-ask spread and other indicators of liquidity like depth and so on. So there is a twin impact. On one hand, there is an impact on directly on an impact of profitability that can be taken away from the made in the market, that lowers participation. And on the other hand, one find that there is a liquidity impact which indirectly feeds back into us cost. That's one reason that could be adding to the relative lower efficiency which we observe. The second is, of course, as we know, from a wider perspective, the participation is largely limited to, near month and same month futures contracts. The long-term players in the market, which are institutions, don't really actively participate in the market. Their share accounts for some 0.5% or so in the open interest in some contracts we could observe. Of course, if an arbitrager were to really appear in the market, then obviously one need to have sure access to inventory. But I think being able to procure inventory in the right time at a reasonable cost is hard in India. And plus, if you were to really engage in an arbitrage transaction, one should end up, rolling the near month contracts one over the other. That actually leads to higher rollover cost and the basis risk that one would have at that point in time. Institutions like banks don't participate in the domestic market. Therefore, it makes it difficult for them to extend metal loans. If you don't participate in the market, then if you're extending a loan, one is taking an exposure to the price movement in the market. So the absent institutional participation and higher cost, one could reasonably expect that the liquidity is lower in some of these commodities, especially in the long run, and that could actually eventually figure out as, relatively lower efficiency for the market. Then as a different posture, what we build on is, of course, we know that one step that is taken is to bring physical delivery into the market. And we know that physical delivery ideally actually leads to better price convergence, because we are no more dependent on, cash market. We are actually forcing everyone to really be, taking a position in the metals contract towards the end of the contract. And that should ensure higher degree of convergence between the two prices. While that is, that is a dream in theory, we know that in practice it can actually lead to a lot more nuanced issues. Suddenly, if the spot market develops, a disruption, like probably crude in, April or May of 2020, we can say that that could actually lead to a far greater divergence between the two prices. The expected spot price was this, but it turned out to be very different as the contract gets close to maturity. Plus, we know that, there could be obstructions in supply and demand of these commodities, and therefore it is much easier sometimes in thinly traded commodities for uh, to really have someone influence, I wouldn't say manipulate, influence the prices, because you can actually say that, the supply is limited to this. Therefore, whether introduction of the physical settlement has actually led to an all-round improvement in market efficiency is an open question. It depends on what has happened post that, while theory predicts that it ought to be, mostly improving the efficiency. So what we have done is, we have actually tried to examine, almost in an analogous way as we did in case of market efficiency, which I presented a little earlier. How has the efficiency changed before and after the introduction of the physical delivery in the market? Or the question is, has the convergence between the spot market and the futures market become better after the introduction of the physical settlement? So we use the similar mechanics. You can just imagine that what we have done is we take how closely does the spot price changes are tracked by the basis before the regulation, and how closely does it track that post the regulation. Is there any observable difference? That's what we are actually sort of studying this. Of course, econometrically we are doing it in a different way, but that's what essentially we are doing. So here are the results that we have. The point to notice is the dark, bands here. You can see that these darker colored stacks are necessarily indicating how much has the relationship between spot and futures changed after the introduction of the physical settlement. Ideally, if there was no change in the market efficiency on account of the physical delivery mandate, we wouldn't have really seen a large value for this number. Of course, you can see that the value here is very small, almost not distinct from zero. Ideally, one should not really see a difference. Now, that's one case. Still better would be, okay, the overall efficiency of the market was low prior to the introduction of the physical settlement, but after the introduction of the physical settlement, say for example here, it has actually become better, because these two things together actually becomes close to 1. What is the light colored stack? The light colored bar is necessarily what is the efficiency on an average. In fact, that's the average efficiency, and then you can imagine that this is the incremental efficiency brought about by the introduction of the physical delivery. In fact, what we find is, for example, if you take aluminum, for example, we find that the physical delivery mandate has actually made the market a lot worse. It was actually close to 1 before the settlement, in the sense that the spot prices were being very closely tracked by the futures market, and the introduction has actually made it much worse. Now it seems to be overreacting to the changes in the expected spot prices. You can see that similarly for zinc, as another example, you can see that the market now seems to be responding much slower than earlier to the expected changes in spot prices. Or in no commodity, except I can say to some extent in nickel, nowhere else do we observe a significant improvement in market efficiency on account of introduction of the physical settlement, despite such a mandate is expected to really change that. So when we examine the two aspects of market efficiency, what we find is that on one hand, we found that on an average the market has efficiency comparable to other major markets for most commodities on an average, but we find that it is not improving with the physical settlement of the commodities. Okay. So given the time frame that we have, let me quickly then take you to the implications of our findings and what kind of policy suggestions we have. Okay, the first is you can very well observe that the participation in the market actually remains the issue, and deepening and widening that is is a primary focus for regulators and whoever else is interested in the market. And we know that having a forward curve for prices ranging from a single day maturity to a year or more is something that ideally everyone cherish. If you really have a full forward curve, then one can easily look up the forward curve and see where the prices are going to be. Then accordingly, a fabricator can go and settle his price, an importer can go and sort of set his planning what kind of cost is likely. A bilateral contract can be signed. The government can actually sort of invite tenders and settle them, and relying on the inputs which are provided by the bidding parties. But unfortunately, when the market is largely restricted to the near and same month futures, we know that being able to really evolve a forward curve which can really serve as a benchmark of the market is actually challenging. So therefore, in a way, the benchmark that we can really have domestically at this point of time is a partial benchmark. Even if our prices are actually efficient for the near month and same month, the kind of price indication that it would serve for market to really plan for future is actually quite limited to a short horizon. Therefore, it is important to really get participants who can really offer, or use their long-term view in the commodities to really bring to a trade. We think that a right step in this direction is to really get the banks to participate in the market. Imagine here is a bank which is taking exposure to firms. We know that when they are actually lending to firms, even if one is actually lending to a company like Ashok Leyland, in a way there is actually a bet they are taking actually on the commodities prices. You may be lending to Tata Motors, but in a way you are actually taking exposure to the metal content of that business, and therefore price changes to the extent the company has not really hedged, you are actually getting exposed to that. If the banks so desire, and given the extent to which they have skills, or they would build skills, they can actually de-risk part of the loan by hedging the risk of the underlying commodity prices. So their participation is quite important, and such ability to really uh, sterilize the price risk of the commodities by banks would allow them to easily extend metal loans in the market. That would actually also help further improve the overall financing of the market. We think that necessary to improve the participation in the market is recognition of the commodities market. That is different from equity. Equity is just about investments, and of course one can say that wealth is being built, but here is risk being managed, and the ideal purpose of this market is necessarily to build capabilities to hedge one's risk, and therefore it is actually a fundamental economic function which is being performed along with price discovery and providing an alternative investment opportunity. Therefore, the commodities transaction tax which is imposed, one need to lighten that or abolish it totally. The other way to really make the market less costly for participants is, we think that where the volume is lacking is in the longer term contracts, margining them at a lower rate, and then increasing the stepping up the margin over time rather than impose the same kind of margin levels for short maturities would be one way to really attract more liquidity in the market. Of course, we know that in markets like LME, even if there is MTM losses, the MTM losses are not really debited to the account of the client, of the trader, on a day-to-day basis. That actually makes the market less costly for traders, whereas we have far stricter prudential norms and tighter margining requirements. Therefore, overall, probably our markets are actually quite safe. Therefore, some kind of uh, uh, incentivization, not by providing direct incentive, but by providing low margins could be helpful to build volumes in longer maturity contracts. We think that like what we saw in China, one could actually directly or indirectly incentivize the MSMEs to hedge through the domestic market. We could actually sort of have different ways by which we can nudge them to do that. These are aspects which can help deepen the participation in the market. Of course, one major problem in actually in running the commodities market is necessarily how the inventories are funded. The example from China really shows that all kinds of funding is actually available to them. They can easily use a warehouse receipt, even the electronic format of that, and quickly engage and get funding. Therefore, being able to really get access to inventory and at the cheapest cost is quite an important step for developing the market further. We think that first of all, if an arbitrager were to really set up a trade and quickly were delivery to be made or taken delivery, then obviously he need to really have access to, he should actually feel the confidence to quickly move inventories. So one way by which metal inventories can be made available to them is to probably have agreement with international exchanges like LME and set up accredited warehouses in India in free trade zones. And these warehouses can quickly allow someone to really take out the stock of the metal necessarily by just paying the import duty and then quickly make it available on Indian customs region. Of course, if these metals are actually held in warehouses in international free trade zones, obviously the International Financial Services Central Authority could probably allow banks to really facilitate loans to such commodity stocks. On the domestic side, the RBI could actually nudge banks to really develop products which could help fund these inventories at a cheaper cost. Warrant creation is quite important, and being able to really use warrants as an underlying mechanism for funding is quite important. Even if the RBI finds it hard to allow banks to, allow metal loans, the international banking units located in IFSCA can probably allow that to happen. Lowering the cost of financing and holding inventory is quite a significant step that is required to improve the market. Of course, one problem that we found everyone keeps echoing is that the current delivery practice imposes a huge cost on participants to really take delivery of the metals and things in places which are of their choice, because the GST that they pay is not necessarily transferable. We were thinking that one solution to this could be it could be the delivery could be brought underneath the IGST. In which case the GST credit could be claimed against other items which they have. Of course, deepening of the spot market is also a important step that is required. One can really say that go and set up a spot exchange, but we think an intermediate step could be to really set up daily rolling contracts. Then that could actually remain as a quasi spot market. And given a quasi spot market or a daily rolling contract, it becomes easier for a trader who has actually agreed to take delivery quickly really reverse that transaction effectively. Today in the market, we don't really have that flexibility. If someone is committed to delivery, then obviously you would end up delivering. Therefore, providing that flexibility could be useful. And then we have a couple of minor suggestions. One is actually about visibility for the domestic benchmarks. We know that at least for the near month and the same month futures, we actually have liquidity and price efficiency, despite the marginal deterioration of that during the physical delivery period. It is important for us to promote our own market. I think the Chinese market is no accident. It is actually a deliberate design and intervention by the regulator. So being able to really provide more visibility to the domestic price benchmark is quite important. Government could probably use the domestic rupee denominated benchmark for announcing export incentives, tendering of state-owned firms with domestic sourcing and so on. In a way, actually legitimizing the market in the eyes of people and other entities who are interested. At another way, we can probably improve, the concern of the market about metal price risk and the entities involved is to really strengthen and unify the regulatory norms which are related to disclosure on commodities price risk. Right now, while that is the listing obligations mandate that, the format is not necessarily very useful. In fact, I was just reading the disclosure of one of the automobile firms. They just say that, okay, we have this amount of commodities price risk, but there is no mention of, what kind of losses are likely if prices were to really move by so much. One need to sit down and then, calculate that oneself, but it will be useful if that is actually provided directly in a tabular format. If a value at risk estimate is done by the company and disclosed, that could be quite useful, so that one can understand how much risk you're chewing up when you're doing an investment and so on. So of course, there is an all-round feeling, rather among all entities, that we don't really have enough understanding of the commodities markets when we talk to institutions, when we talk to individual participants. Therefore, there is a need to really, for the regulator to get onto a development perspective and think that, we need to familiarize the participants and the ecosystem with commodities related knowledge. In that sense, developing courses on commodities trading, commodities risk management, that kind of steps could be quite value adding for the overall market. Of course, right now there are a number of programs that entities are actually launching, including MCX and probably brokers associations and so on, to spread awareness about the commodities markets. But they could be more long-term courses which is giving certification about certain standard about commodities knowledge being available with individuals. I think institutions like NISM or any other can probably start with launching these courses. Yeah, that's all I have right now in the presentation. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for this wonderful presentation. And we have been much enlightened by not only just the findings of this elaborate study that you have done, which was not just a kind of a desk work, and the statistical work that you have done, which is also very, very rich, but also the output from your interactions with the market stakeholders is also very much visible. So, thank you for taking so much of effort in, coming out with those findings about something which is very, very important, very significant for India's commodity markets, given the stage at which the market is in right now. So we'll take a few questions, time permitting. So one of the things that we, from the report and from the presentation that you've made today, so a big issue actually in terms of the efficiency of the market you have identified is rather, the reason why, a lot of arbitrage opportunities cannot come in and arbitrage cannot happen, and therefore efficiency cannot come about, is the unavailability of ready delivery of metals. Something that probably, we see in the bullion commodities, for example. And one of the solutions you have provided is, introducing some contracts like the daily rolling settlement futures contracts. Which is like something we can take from a leaf we can take from LME, which is very successful over there. Just wondering, why aren't you really recommending going for a full-fledged spot trading platform, a spot exchange regulated by maybe the market regulator, securities market regulator? Because spot exchange seems to be the, the flavor of the season, and with the bullion spot exchange coming up very soon, it seems to be addressing a lot of concerns in the physical market side, the non-derivative market side of the metals market also, as much as it is for bullion. So what's your idea of about having a full-fledged regulated spot exchange for metals?
No, the only point that we were considering is I was involved in developing a first study in India on the viability of a gold spot exchange along with my colleague Jayant Verma. And when we count the number of years, it's actually like, almost 4 years plus over. And still we are talking about, what are the modalities, who will run it, will there be enough demand? So I think, 4 or 5 years has passed. Okay, gold being an investment commodity, and everyone seemed to be quite against gold. Actually, the government sees it as a huge liability. And I think from our interaction and our experience with IGPC at IMA, we always felt that I'm sorry. Everyone sees gold as a problem metal, and therefore you can actually kick the can down the road. But our view about base metals ought to be quite different, because we think that this is what ought to be driving the economy, and therefore it cannot be really allowed to wait for 4 or 5 years for market to become more liquid. So therefore, we only thought that yeah, maybe a spot market is an eventual solution, but do we need to necessarily wait until that long? Because this can necessarily become de facto spot market and getting the same ecosystem, leveraging on the same ecosystem rather than building something new. I agree. Eventually, if we can really have a well-functioning spot market side by side with a futures market, then obviously we get that value. But given the experience that in front of us, and the fact that one doesn't have to really go elsewhere, the participants are there, and if there is enough demand, then one can create that flexibility. That was the thought that we had.
So you're talking of a more pragmatic kind of a solution rather than the ideal solution.
Yeah.
Okay.
Devjit, can I come in?
Sure, sir. Sure.
On the rolling settlement, as he has suggested. So the challenge here is the price pooling and how the settlement will happen, or rolling settlement, as you have just mentioned. So getting a price discovery or is a difficult task to get. So how do you suggest that, basically, if we come up with that kind of instrument, rolling settlement, daily rolling settlement, how it will settle?
Yeah, one problem that it would get into is there is a fractionation of the orders that would happen into the market, but of course, one does not have necessarily a via media thought through, like, how would we get the price discovery done. But absent that, we know that it leaves little flexibility for traders necessarily to, get away from the delivery. Once the delivery notice is given, there is almost no flexibility available today in the market for traders. So therefore, something equivalent we need to build. Of course, we haven't really thought through the last miles as to how will we get to that point. Yeah.
So, one more point. In last part of your presentation, you mentioned that disclosure of this hedged by the corporates. So you have suggested the value at risk to be, disclosed by the corporates. So I am again in various committees, and I would like, because this idea was given by me only, because when we were requesting for CTD reduction and hedging in India, so the figures were not available. So in one of the meeting with the pre-budget meeting, I asked for the kind of hedging happening in India and overseas. So those figures were not there. So on my request, not my request, the collective request of everyone, they made it compulsory to have for listed companies to at least disclose their hedging part. So going further, can we have some format where we can have value at risk also to be disclosed by them?
Yeah, the US market has equivalent regulation, right? What is that? SEC regulations, item 305 or something of the 10K that actually that offers 3 different formats in which the disclosure could be made. You could actually have a tabular format. You could really have disclosure with war. But in India, right now, what we have specified is give us the value of the exposure or the quantity of the exposure, and whether you have how much have you hedged in the domestic market, how much have you hedged in the international market. If one were to really go and figure out the details of which, then obviously one has to work it out oneself. It's not that it is impossible given the quantity that is tied up. One cannot work it out. One can, but I think it is a good idea to really have one of these options being left to the companies like in the US. Very clearly, there is a much more detailed much more detailed information is available in the US market, with which one can judge, how much is the risk being taken up. I think the US model is quite good enough um, to really think as an alternative, so that there is quality of disclosure which is uniform to all. Yeah.
Thank you. Rishiji, can we have some deliberation on this going forward? So what kind of disclosure we can demand from the listed companies, and ask the regulator to insist for that?
I think
Rishiji
Rishiji
or
has
Devajit.
yes, got another
Devajit,
meeting.
we should take it up, and deliberate on those.
Of course. Rishiji, I think, has left. He's got another meeting, so I'll convey your message to him. Sure. Another, the issue about which probably is a solution for a lot of issues, including market efficiency and liquidity, etc. And also, you have made it in your report. Also, is about financial players' participation, much more than what is being allowed, being contemplated now. Much more than that, we need financial players' participation in the Indian markets because of a host of reasons. However, you have also pointed out that probably in your interactions with the financial market participants, financial players participants, you have pointed out that some of them are reluctant because of lower liquidity of the longer term commodities derivative contracts. I'm just quoting from in your report itself. So we are aren't we getting into a chicken and egg story? Because if the financial players themselves don't come because of lower liquidity in longer term commodities, and others also do not come because of the same reason and the fact that financial players are not there, I mean, how do we break from this juggernaut? It's
I agree. It is a sort of chicken and egg problem, and the liquidity is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and vicious or virtuous cycle, whichever way you want to really see that. But I think steps could be lowering the transaction cost, probably having incentives offered to MSMEs to really sort of, bring their hedging to the market, offer more attractive financing terms. That would require the banks necessarily offer metal loans, and improving the availability of inventory in the market. So we cannot necessarily see that as one fine moment at which the problem would actually start disappearing, but rather take small sort of incremental steps to eventually improve the quality and liquidity of the market. So I don't see that as a chicken and egg problem to be solved at one moment, or it's solved as an automata by itself, but taking these incremental steps to strengthen the market.
Right. Let's hope this juggernaut is kind of broken at the soonest possible. So, Professor, in your report and in the presentation also, you have placed a lot of importance on the role played by banks. The fact that banks are not allowed in the market is actually a big drawback, and you have provided a host of wish list, call it agenda for the banks, the Indian banks, and their participation would be beneficial in multiple of ways. So things like you have given direct suggestions like offering metal loans or structured solutions to finance metals. Also, this expansion of the international banking units at IFSC, a host of things you have suggested for the banks. So out of all of these, if I were to ask you, which is one big thing that one should be pushing for insofar as the banks are concerned, what would be your suggestion?
I think the big step would be to allow them to participate in the commodities market and allow them to extend metal loans in the market, and then they can actually go and hedge the price risk. That would bring commodities is an active problem in their mind, which would need RBI and NIFSCA probably energizing or educating the banks about the opportunity. I think that would get them into the market.
Right. We hope that again. Let's hope that's not just simply
Yeah,
wishful
with
thinking. We hope
the
it
International
happens
Financial
soon.
Services Central Authority in action mode, probably at least the IBUs can kickstart to fund
Okay.
the non-domestic side.
Yeah, and probably the domestic ones can emulate their example.
Yes.
So the one point you have made about your analysis in answering to the question whether markets have become more efficient after the physical delivery, the markets have moved into the physical delivery mode. I think by and large you found that markets have not become more efficient after physical.
Yes.
The contracts have become physically deliverable. And the results that you have cited are things like lack of access to inventory for arbitrageurs, tax compliance costs, and some of such things which to a reader looks kind of institutional issues. So therefore the solutions to these seems to be again institutional solutions, and addressing these issues again could be quite a longer term solution. So till this longer term solution come about, can we look at any kind of a near term solution so that we don't continue with this less than perfect or less than desirable kind of efficiency of these contracts?
Yeah, I think that's where. Yeah, of course, we know that there are no perfect solutions that sit anywhere. But I think that's where actually thinking of rather than as this one problem to be cracked for all and cleanly solved, thinking about those incremental steps would be one way of looking at things. We know that, for instance, it's actually a jolt to the market to have CTT,
Yeah.
right? Now, how do we actually lower the transaction cost? How do we actually get more of domestic firms onto the market to really hedge their risk rather than being reliant on long-term supply contracts? The point is, you are reliant on long-term supply contracts with your large partners. Think about it. In a way, you are actually sort of buying a risk solution from them at a certain price. But the hedging that you would do through the market is actually a solution which ought to be cheaper in a liquid market, because these are risks being taken by a large number of diversified entities, who may be actually putting to risk few thousand rupees on in the commodities market. So therefore, that is actually a cheaper solution to really hedge your risk. And therefore, can we educate them? Can we get them onto the market? That takes me to this point that one way by which we can think of getting them to hedge in the domestic market is to probably give them incentivization by way of some subsidized interest rate if you are fully hedged using the domestic exchange. I think that those are the steps that we need to take to rather than wait for the big bang, which seem to be far away. Yeah.
So I think we have time for just one last question, which is about the theme itself, which is about the price benchmark, price benchmark for metals, how to develop them in India within the domestic economy. And one of the kind of an out of the box solution that you have suggested is that the government can nudge the ecosystem participants to refer to the domestic price benchmarks rather than the international price benchmarks for their for the transactions, etc.
Yeah.
So just could you give some one or two very kind of a low hanging fruit examples where it would not really be disruptive to the system and would be beneficial to the participants, where
I was thinking maybe the government actually announces that, okay, fine, here is someone who is out to really take a. In terms of participation, you are actually, if you are mentioning about or thinking about increased participation, I was thinking that, okay, fine, here is a MSME which actually has used the domestic market to hedge their risk. Can we prioritize them for their loan approval? We know that right now we have 59 minutes loans, PSU loan, and things of that kind. maybe there is a priority that we can actually set up for them. Maybe there is an interest subsidy that can actually go up to them. We provide PLI scheme to encourage industries to do domestic sourcing, right? This is something parallel, use the domestic market to really hedge their risk. Can we really have something equivalent of a PLI? Of course, in terms of how the government can actually bring more visibility, I think, of course, we know that forcing them to really only take the domestic market route would be leading to price distortion if the market is not sufficiently, liquid and efficient. But using in tender forms, prices quoted from domestic market, using in incentive schemes which they announce, prices which are rupee denominated and quoted from the domestic market. These would actually lend a, sort of more visibility to the market. That kind of a legitimization is required, rather than thinking of commodities market as a speculative place where people actually try to just sort of wildly speculate on commodities which they don't really have much of interest or understanding of. I think that destigmatization is very much required by lending legitimacy to the market.
Excellent. I think those two words were very, very appropriate. Destigmatization and legitimization, of course. And the examples that you have given, I think that will go a long way in terms of if governments or PSUs start using the domestic rupee denominated prices for their own tendering processes, etc. That would really be very helpful in terms of these two things of legitimization and destigmatization. And finally, the longer term target that we are looking at, which is emergence of a domestic price as the benchmark for the price within the domestic economy. So I think we have time for these questions only. So thank you, Professor, for patiently answering all these questions. Before I end this session, I request Mr. Sandeep Jain, Chairman, Seminar and Convention Committee of CPAI and Director, TradeSwift, Jaipur, to kindly give the vote of thanks and the concluding remarks. Mr. Jain, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Devojit Dey. And it was really very interesting. And when it comes to the name IIM Ahmedabad, actually, that is a dream institute for everyone in the country. And in fact, I was also, trying for those skies, but I landed up to KJ Somaiya, though I could not bell the cat. But then I really tried, and it's a dream institute. So, and in fact, listening to you was actually very enlightening, and you were excellent in some of the suggestions. And I really loved one suggestion is that, incentivizing the hedgers to come to the platform. And actually, that is very important because hedgers are somehow not coming to our platforms, and they are not actually using the exchanges for the very purpose the exchanges are actually formed. And we have also been working. In fact, CPAI is actually working towards that front also. But then it will take time. But yes, in fact, setting up our own benchmarks, it's again a very big priority for our markets also, even the regulators, even our organization, our CPAI as an organization has been working a lot towards this. And we are actually inviting lots of international speakers, also lots of industry participants also to participate in our convention. So we have been doing this since last, I think, 15, 17 years. But anyways, thank you to Mr. Rishi Nathani also for the introduction, and Mr. Wadhwaji, in fact, Wadhwaji, for your inaugural remarks. And thank you, Mr. Joshi Jacob, again, once again. And thank you, Mr. Devojyoti, sorry, I'm so sorry, Devojyoti ji, for conducting the whole thing so well. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. Thanks to CPAI and Mr. Wadhwa once again. And with that, we conclude this session. We'll probably be having another session in the, again, not so distant future, where we take up another study and we deliberate on the findings of that, having significance for the development and growth of India's commodity markets. Thank you all. Thanks all the participants.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.